This slide shows common types of assessments: formative, diagnostic, and summative, and the various times within instruction we use these types of assessments. In the next slides, we'll be going more in depth into each of these common types, specifically starting with formative assessment. What is formative assessment? It's an assessment for learning. They're brief measures of direct student performance, typically administered to all students during benchmarking and some students for progress monitoring. There are formal and informal versions of formative assessment. Formative assessments are iterative, meaning they're administered throughout instruction to help guide instructional decisions. Why do we use formative assessment? It's an identification of students who are non-responsive to instruction or intervention. It helps us determine response to current instruction, whether we're talking about Tier 1 core instruction or we're talking about more intensive supports in terms of Tier 2 or individualized supports for Tier 3 interventions. It can be used to identify students who are not responsive and to understand rates of improvement, often not used for grading purposes, but more of a guide to the effectiveness of instruction and whether changes or adjustments are needed. They're also supportive of curriculum and instructional decisions, program evaluation, resource allocation in a proactive model, comparison of instruction and intervention quality and efficacy. These formal and informal formative assessments are generally brief measures of direct student performance. Informal assessments are content and performance driven, whereas formal assessments have data that support the conclusions made from the test, including evidence of reliability and validity, measures of bias and distortion. There are also typically standardized in scoring and administration. Measures of reliability refers to the extent in which the score is accurate and consistent, and the extent to which the slope of improvement accurately represents rates of improvement. Measures of validity refer to the extent to which the score represents the underlying construct, meaning the accuracy of the assessment. Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? And the extent to which the slope of improvement corresponds to end level performance on highly valued outcomes, such as state math assessments and so on. The formal, valid, reliable, and standardized assessments have been tried before on students and have outcomes that support the conclusions that when a student is responding or performing well on the assessment, that they are not at risk, and that students performing below certain cut scores or points on the assessment are at risk. Scores such as percentiles, stand-ins, or standard scores are commonly received as part of this type of formal assessment. Compared to the informal assessment, these are often teacher-made: exit slips, observations, interviews, running records, quizzes, and so forth. These help to determine on a day-to-day, quick, informal basis how students are responding to instruction. Diving a little bit deeper into formative assessments, on this slide we're specifically looking at informal formative assessments. These can be used to help teachers quickly determine what to teach and help in the selection of appropriate instructional strategies and supports. These are often mastery measures of proficiency of a specific skill rather than global indicators. They're often not monitoring the maintenance of skills, meaning checking back on skills after they've been taught, instructed, or intervened on. These informal assessments can be used diagnostically to help teachers determine how to adjust their instruction based on student need before getting to a summative assessment. In the first example of a multiplication running record, the teacher can really dig into what the student knows and what the student may not know. Do they have strategies to solve these problems? Can they immediately recall with fluency these multiplication facts, or are there specific ones that they struggle? Are they continuously counting on their fingers and counting up, or do they have other strategies that they use? Compared to the second example, which are exit slips. These can be given to a whole group of students. They can happen really quickly, informally, and don't need extensive amounts of time ahead to plan. Both examples can provide you really valuable information about what a student knows and struggles with. In both examples, it requires the educators to look past the correct and incorrect answers and really try to look for the processes the students use to understand their thinking. Let's look at some examples of informal formative assessments that can be used to gauge how students are doing within daily core instruction. Now we'll be digging into two specific types of formal formative assessment. The first being screening. Are students at risk for poor learning outcomes? And the second, progress monitoring. How are they responding to instruction? When discussing various assessments, including screening and progress monitoring, they can both be norm referenced and criteria referenced, depending on what information you're trying to gather. Determining the type of assessment used oftentimes is not measured by the look of the assessment, but more about how the scores are calculated and reported. A norm reference assessment is a student is measured against those taking the test, not against any defined criteria. It permits a fixed proportion of students to pass and fail. Because there are differences in the students taking the test from year to year, the standards that are set vary. Many tests provide national or state norms that have been derived from formal norming studies. Local norms can also be established using statistical methods. This normed information really helps us get a sense of how students are responding to instruction. Is it typical compared to their peers or a certain group of students, or is it not? Compared to criterion referenced assessments, these are used to identify a student's specific strengths and weaknesses in relation to an age or a grade level standard. It does not compare students with other students. The standards do not change because the criteria typically do not vary from year to year. There are multiple ways to determine the criteria that are used. They can be specific standards in a unit, a set of skills expected to be learned by a certain point. For example, by the winter of fourth grade, how is my student doing on grade level standards? This will not tell you how the student is doing compared to other fourth grade students. A real life example I like to think about for criterion referenced assessments is if you've ever been to a carnival or an amusement park, think about the signs that read, "You must be this tall to ride the ride," with an arrow pointing to a specific line on a height chart. The line indicated by the arrow functions as the criterion. The ride operator compares each person's height against it before allowing them to get on the ride. If you're interested in knowing how a student compares with other students in the screening process, you would probably be most interested in a norm referenced assessment. Compared to if you want to screen for which students met or did not meet a set of criterion, typically a score, then you would be interested in a criterion referenced assessment. Again, some assessments can be both norm referenced and criteria referenced. It doesn't depend on the look of the assessment, it's more about how the scores are reported. Now, let's dive deeper into a specific formal formative assessment called screening, also sometimes referred to as the universal screening. The purpose of screening is to identify those students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. It's used to designate students who might be in need of closer monitoring in their general education curriculum or of a more intense intervention. Tools in an MTSS framework are typically standardized, validated, and reliable measures of formative assessment. We briefly described validity and reliability, but to find out more information or determine if the tools that you're using is valid and reliable, you can visit the National Center on Intensive Interventions tools chart at intensiveintervention.org. Screening occurs multiple times a year and can be used to determine students that are at risk for poor learning outcomes. It can be used to support evaluation program effectiveness, establish local norms and cut scores, and also provide data for next year's teachers. All students should take universal screening, and it's recommended at least 3 times per year. Remember, just because a student falls below the cut score on a screen does not mean they definitely will need more intensive supports such as a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention. The screener is a great starting point, but we may need to provide more progress monitoring data to determine if they are truly at risk. In the next slide, we will review the uses and purpose for universal screening in more detail. Purpose of universal screening and how do we use universal screening in schools? The purpose is to identify who is struggling, which students require further follow-up to determine the level of support that they need. It also provides schools, grade levels, and class data about the distribution of students across the tiers. Are approximately 80% of students responding to core instruction, and how has that changed over the course of the year? On the slide, you can see the graph image on the left for the fall, winter, and spring to see how that percentage has changed over time. Another example is in the winter, we can identify which students are on track to meet the end of year benchmark. We can use it to identify students that might have began struggling, but were not necessarily at risk in the fall, and we can determine whether students are responding to current interventions. Compared to in the spring, we can use the universal screening data to document students' end-of-year performance and identify which students might benefit from additional instruction over the summer or at the start of the following school year. So universal screening data can be used for multiple purposes depending on what time of year you are looking at the data. In the following video, principals will share their perspective on the importance of screening from their experience and how screening systems and processes are used in their school to identify students most at risk for learning outcomes.
For us, there's kind of the practical piece of universal screening and then the piece that works for the kid. Ultimately, it all works for the kid, but we have to start somewhere. We have to know who needs the help. For us as a magnet school, a 6, 7, 8 magnet school, when our 6th graders come to us, they can come from some 40-something elementary schools. And we don't necessarily own them. They didn't necessarily come to us from one of our other magnet schools in our capital region area. They could have come from almost anywhere. So we really know little about them. So it is critical, that universal screening component is critical, and there comes the practical piece to really know where do our students stand and who needs some sort of help in what area. So that's very critical for us to have. And then, of course, from grade to grade, we need to figure out where everyone is. And I think at that point, that's where progress monitoring sort of starts to take over as we track where students are along the spectrum. But as things change, in particular as units in math change, as the complexity of reading increases as you go from one grade to another, you still can't forget about those universal screens that may scoop up some students who you missed before because they were making it with their understanding on one level, but now the bar got raised and now they're falling behind. So you have to maintain your universal screens because it allows you to truly identify the students who you need to get into your program.
In our universal screening, it again is very much, we need to somewhere kind of filter out the kids that do need help and do not need, they're already benchmark students, which are on grade level. And so I think the universal screening, it just really helps us say, okay, we know that some students are going to need interventions, but and that initial universal screening will tell us who needs the interventions, and then we can take those and decide which path they need to do. We can do some more individual diagnostic testing to see which path they really need to follow. And then that's where we break out into different interventions depending on what the diagnostics show.
I see the importance of screening being that how else will you know if you have any students falling through the cracks? It's so easy to hide in the masses of students in a classroom that is treated as a classroom and not as individuals, that the screening is key to finding those students that otherwise wouldn't show up.
Screening is probably the most critical piece, because if we don't screen, we have no way of knowing whether we have a class-wide problem or we have an individual student problem. And the interventions are so different. So that's really critical for us.
Screening isn't always black and white. As we previously stated, during screening, just because a student is identified as being at risk may not necessarily mean they need secondary intervention supports. Screening students to determine risk can result in 4 possible categories. The first category being students that are true positives, meaning these are students that truly are at risk of not meeting the end of year benchmarks or standards when provided high quality Tier 1 instruction. These are students that will need intervention on foundational skills in addition to scaffolds, differentiation, and supports during the Tier 1 instruction. Compared to our true negative students, these are students that we identified as not being at risk and truly do not need intervention supports beyond scaffolds, differentiation, and instruction in the Tier 1 setting. From there, we start to get into the gray area of screening. Types B, false positives, and C, false negatives. The first type of error is false positives, in which children who eventually become academically competent score below the cut point on the screening tool. So educators therefore consider them to be at risk. According to Fletcher et al. And Jenkins and O'Connor, false positives undermine prevention by stressing school resources to provide Tier 2 intervention to an inflated percentage of students. The second type of error is false negatives. These are children who score above the cut score on a predictive instrument, but who later develop academic problems. A classification process that produces large numbers of false negatives diminish the effects of prevention efforts by depriving at-risk students of the early intervention that they require. All screening measures will misidentify some students as either needing assistance when they do not, false positives, or needing assistance when they do, false negatives. When screening students, educators will want to maximize both the number of students correctly identified as at risk, also known as a measure sensitivity, and the number of students correctly identified as not at risk, a measure specificity. These measures depend on the cut score used to classify children at risk. Schools that set a cut score too high run the risk of spending resources on students who do not need help, and schools that set a cut score too low run the risk of not providing intervention to students who are at risk and need extra instruction. If a school or district consistently finds that students receiving intervention do not need it, the measurement team should consider lowering the cut score. To maximize the number of students correctly identified, schools often refer to a multi-gated system that looks at progress monitoring and other sources of assessment data to confirm the student's need for additional supports outside of Tier 1 core instruction. For the false positive students, classroom data such as informal and formal assessments, including unit assessments, Teacher-made quizzes and exit slips can support accurate identification by showing that the student has competencies and grade level skills. Educators will want to continuously progress monitor these students to ensure they don't have a regression or slide in their skills. In a later slide, we'll come back to this idea of false positives and negatives and share some examples of how schools try to maximize their identification during screening using various summative assessments. Summative assessments, both curricular and outcome, can be beneficial data second level as teams determine students' at-risk status for the following year. The summative assessments from previous instruction or even the previous year can help to confirm identification of risk and maximize the accuracy of identifications. These are not great initial predictors of risk status as they only assess content from a specific grade level, but they can be beneficial as a second level to support the identification from a universal screener. We want to use summative assessment data in connection with our screening data to determine the accuracy of our identification. Some schools have found that to help accurately classify students at risk, they're using a second level screener. For example, a school might use a STAR math screener as their initial screen and then gather more information regarding the false positives and false negatives by administering another assessment, MBSP or CBM, to students between a certain level, which in turn has helped them to more accurately classify their at-risk students, improve intervention effectiveness, and more adequately use resources and personnel at the school level. Now, I would like you to take a moment, pause the video, and reflect on screening in your school and classroom. What type of screening tool do you use, and when do you use it? How is it used to identify students at risk for math difficulties? Do you use it? Is it used by a team, by the whole school, or by certain individuals? And what do you like about your screening tool, or what do you dislike about your screening tool? Pause the video now.